So the existing story about Black history in North Dakota is essentially that it's a history of dispersal rather than community. So a dispersionist history where you study individuals and particular events rather than a communalist history where you can look at a group of people across time and identify major threads of continuity and sustained community. So the questions that arise looking at this historiography is this strictly speaking true? And of course, no. I mean, it would just require time to try applying a communalist lens to the history. But to the extent that it points at a truth, you have to ask, why was Black migration to North Dakota less successful in terms of sustained community than migration to other parts of the plains and West, with examples that stand out being Nicodemus, Kansas, the entire state of Montana in the first decades of the 20th century. So why was community less sustained? One explanation would be to look to Oregon and ask if the law prevented in-migration. In Oregon, from the very beginning of colonization, laws were passed saying Black people are not legally allowed to reside in the state. And that was attempted in North Dakota, but it failed. And when you look at subsequent history, we have maybe one example that I'll talk about of use of the law to prevent in-migration by Black people. Another explanation would be to look to Montana and ask if racist terrorism was used to dismantle Black community. If mobs drove people out of town, if civic leaders shut down churches. That's also not quite the case, as Black community in North Dakota never became as established as places like Miles City or Helena, Montana. What does show up in the historical record is repeated allegations by white people that it was something about the essence of the place of North Dakota that was hostile to Black people. They blame the cold, the mosquitoes, the snow, and they say, oh, these folks used to live, here, we used to have these neighbors, and then they just left. And of course the question is, well, why did they leave? Because none of that rings true, as hopefully the subsequent survey of Black history in the state of North Dakota that I have prepared should indicate. Yes, the climate was different than the southern states or the mid-Atlantic or the eastern seaboard, but so was Montana, so was Omaha, so was Nicodemus. So in this vlog, I'll get into a bit of history and then talk at the end about what can we find as far as answers to these questions. Before we consider why the causes for Black community in North Dakota's history being so dispersed or maybe sporadic, we should also consider how Western is North Dakota so we can understand how it fits in this space of the Black West. Like many Western states, North Dakota has a dual identity as both Western and Midwestern. It's part of the frontier strip of states from North Dakota to Texas, all of which have notable east-west divides, especially when you consider a definition of the West that's based in aridity, with western North Dakota being very arid, having little rain, and the eastern part of the state being much more humid and having a lot of farmland like you'd see in the Midwest. However, if you consider the history of the West, the history of settlement and colonization, North Dakota as a whole state fits pretty clearly in that category. Black migration to North Dakota can be said to be broadly in line with the history of the state. As a part of Black Western history, the first major wave of non-native settlement came too late, the 1880s, to stand out as a prominent destination for exodusters, that is, for North Dakota to stand out. Later on, as a non-industrial region, it also didn't feature, the state, as a particularly notable place in the Great Migration. So the first distinguishable pattern for migration of Black people to what came to be known as North Dakota was with the fur trade. The earliest documented history of Black people on the land, now called North Dakota, is as fur traders. A much noted fact is that the first recorded non-native birth within today's boundaries was of a black child in Pembina, North Dakota. Of course, it wasn't North Dakota at the time, and it wasn't even clear whether it would be the United States or Canada. Nonetheless, it was very much the West. Not all of the black people involved in fur trading in the state were free people, so this early history is also the connection to the practice of slavery in that northern part of Dakota Territory. Black cowboys are an important part of Western history, but were not particularly common in North Dakota, adding another wrinkle to this distinction between North Dakota and the rest of the Black West. This is because, being so far north, the state did not participate in major cattle drives, so cowboy culture was not as big a part of the history as people today may think. Of course, to the extent that cowboys were present in North Dakota, confirming the true history of the American cowboy, black families, black cowboys, young black men were all present in this milieu. So, for example, we have this picture of James Tyler, and he ranched in the Badlands of southwestern North Dakota. He was there at the same time as Theodore Roosevelt and the Marquis de Moore, names that all North Dakota school children are made familiar with. James Tyler stayed on after the terrible winter of 1887 to 1888 that drove away so many homesteaders, including black homesteaders in other states, Kansas, Nebraska. He persisted through this really important date. He made a permanent home in North Dakota, marrying and bringing his wife Ella back to live with him. We'll see that family life is really important when we see examples of black life in North Dakota being sustained across major events or separate from just one wave of occupational migration. So we can see how James Tyler's life serves as a bridge between these intermittent occupation-based migrations to North Dakota. Him as a cowboy, other prominent examples being young men who came through the military or steamboating. He is a bridge between that and farming communities, the beginnings of a more permanent nature to settler life in North Dakota, and with that, settler life both for black and white people. North Dakota experienced an incredible ethnic diversity in the first decades after settlement, with rural farming communities representing many European countries, Canadian provinces, and different U.S. states of origin taking shape. The many homesteaders that succeeded formed ethnic enclaves. African Americans arrived in the state alongside these many other competing ethnic groups. The question that must be asked is why African Americans did not form lasting communities, small towns, ethnic enclaves as well, given the clear history of continuous African American presence in the state from the first colonial ventures and the openness created by a society in which sharp ethnic divisions seemingly lessened racial ones. This map records where black homesteaders settled in the state of North Dakota. Part of the answer to why African American settlement in North Dakota was not as sustained is found in the homesteading story. It was a common practice to settle on the plains to prove up a homestead, to build a home, live there for 5 years and acquire ownership of the land, and then sell it off to bonanza farmers. That would be huge corporate operations in the eastern part of the state, speculators, or neighbors, and leave after a few years having gained some wealth from the project. North Dakota grew significantly between statehood and 1930, and during that period, the opportunity to prove up a claim attracted black farmers, but also significant groups of Russian Jewish homesteaders, and as well as more typical Western, Northern European immigrants, people from elsewhere in the Midwest, all coming maybe not to settle permanently, but instead to prove up a claim. So if you look on the map, Mountrail County is one example where we know that this happened. Small farming communities of African Americans were paid to move there as a way for speculators to acquire more land. This map also shows a general pattern of settlement across the northern part of the state, from Grand Forks County to Williams County. This was the northern railroad corridor. The southern railroad corridor Burleigh County, Kidder County, Morton County, east to Cass. A lot of these examples, though, are of communities that might well have lasted longer. If you look down in the southeastern corner, you'll see this dot by Richland County, and we'll move to the next images to talk about that. Lithia in Richland County was perhaps the nearest thing to a black town in North Dakota, with a competing example in McHenry County that hasn't been as well researched. Lithia was a place name attached to the land that used to belong to William Montgomery. Montgomery was born enslaved, but ended up becoming a very wealthy bonanza farmer. He owned the grain elevator there, and the town was originally called Montgomery. You can see here an image of the township showing the land that he owned. So a lot of North Dakota history is these small places that ended up not being able to support a population because more people settled than the agricultural economy could actually support. So by 1930, we see a continuous collapse of the population. North Dakota's pioneering historian is a man named Robinson, and he calls this the too much mistake. And so we can see with examples like Lithia or McHenry County that this too much mistake seems to have had a greater impact on African American homesteaders than the general population of white homesteaders in North Dakota. So we need to consider why it was that that too much mistake fell heavier on black people in North Dakota than white people. And to get a picture of that, it's helpful to look at people who had a slightly more marginal position than those proving up their claims to own their land, which would be the migrant farm laborers that were such a big part of the farm economy of North Dakota prior to the advent of more advanced machinery, for example. So if we can cast our minds back to what we've learned about Black history in Oregon with laws prohibiting Black people from living in the state, we can also understand that in North Dakota that was attempted. It was not successful, but it was attempted. These migrant farm laborers were subject to an instance of the law and law enforcement being used for ethnic cleansing in North Dakota. So farm laborers who didn't own their land included African Americans traveling to North Dakota because they heard about opportunities to work with threshing companies as part of migrating teams. That's what this picture is of. It's here where the clear signs of discrimination appear, because we can find in the eastern part of the state multiple local newspapers reporting instances of public pressure to remove or imprison vagrant laborers, calling to mind the southern Jim Crow vagrancy laws. So even though you could say that you were also trying to get rid of white vagrants, which only happened in instances of actual crime occurring, when it came to Black laborers in North Dakota, this idea of vagrancy as an illegal activity imported from the southern states was used to prevent Black people from coming to North Dakota, stopping them from even taking the further step after making some money as a migrant laborer of trying to find a homestead claim to prove up. The entire story of farming and Black people in North Dakota, however, does include these instances of people who managed to establish themselves in the state even without the formation of long-term communities and evading sort of overt racist discrimination to compel them to leave the state. So we'll look at some photos now of two farmers who had a decades-long presence in the state, Bob Cody and William Sally. And I think what we see with them is how the nuclear family and its extensions was a pretty important institution for the progress of colonization of Americans on this, space in North Dakota that had been indigenous. So these are two of the black men with the longest presence. So on the left here, we have this image of Bob Cody. And in his later years, he actually did work as a hired laborer instead of being able to retire because his wife died before him and he didn't own a lot of land. On the right, we have an example of William Sally and his wife, and they had two sons who are not pictured here, although I did find some images of them in the archives as well. And I think what's really interesting about this family is they were talked about in many, many newspaper articles as the only black farmer left in North Dakota. Of course, referring to the man as the farmer, even though his wife was also part of that. So he outlasted many of his contemporaries from the early years. But his sons then moved away from North Dakota. So it's one of these sort of fleeting stories that is really interesting because of its contrast to other examples of folks that proved up a claim and moved away. So if we want to think about African American migration to North Dakota and sort of periodize it after this period of homesteading and farming settlement in North Dakota, what we need to consider is the Air Force. And that actually really opens up, I think, an interesting sort of new meaning of the West with the advent of the Cold War. So the West is thought of as this place with wide open spaces, and for that reason, it becomes the location of so many new Air Force bases opened up to, test out the military might of the United States and also locate nuclear weapons far from major population centers. And as we know, the armed forces in the United States are one of the most racially diverse settings that you can see in the country and was an avenue to the middle class for a lot of black families. Accordingly, this actually brought the largest wave of black migration to North Dakota in the post-war years in the 60s with the construction of an Air Force base outside Grand Forks and one outside Minot. Those are both cities, again, along this northern population corridor of North Dakota. So with that, we also get a clue of what is it about North Dakota that has meant black community has been so dispersed. The Air Force brought sort of the first recorded movement of anti-racist activism to North Dakota. Of course, this also in the context of the 60s with black freedom movements and civil disobedience. 25 black men and women occupied the dining hall and locked themselves in. This demonstration lasted 6 hours. It attracted the attention of the statewide press, and it resulted in negotiations about the conditions of black airmen at the base. So if we are seeing probably the most quote-unquote black space in North Dakota appearing in Minot with the Air Force Base, and there is unrest about racist mistreatment, then we can only imagine that the adjustment to living in North Dakota with so much dispersed black community was probably much worse than the situation on the base. The image I've chosen here, again, looking at this theme of where can we find black community in North Dakota, what you're seeing is the Minot Air Force Base gospel choir, and the caption from this Tribune article is, it says, "One cultural outlet for blacks in North Dakota." Of course, I would say black people. And I just think that's really interesting because it says one cultural outlet, and yet at the same time, with what I found in my research about the 60s, this was kind of one of the only cultural outlets, maybe the only one if the few black churches across the state had closed already, which all indications are that they had. So in looking at the set of images that we've viewed already as part of this vlog, we've talked about a lot of the reasons African Americans came to North Dakota that have already been published on. And we've tried to look at that example and consider why is it that black settlement in North Dakota wasn't more sustained as in, say, Kansas or Oklahoma, or was not as extensive as states like South Dakota and Iowa, Wyoming, New Mexico, Colorado, all examples of places where it wasn't sustained, but it was a lot more extensive than North Dakota. So when I say it's already been published on, what I mean is this book by Thomas P. Newgard, who was a big source for me because he did sort of the most extensive study of African Americans in North Dakota out there. And he wrote about early settlement and farming a lot. We have Irabel Thompson's memoir, American Daughter, the most, perhaps the only, but the best known memoir of an African American North Dakotan who also left the state and ended up becoming a very famous magazine editor. And then, of course, with all the preceding images, we've considered things that are discussed in Search of the Racial Frontier, the really important work by Quintard Taylor. So what I want to do with the end of this vlog is look at an image and consider some things about more recent history, more recent Western history, and try to integrate that with the exploration we've already been doing. So to wrap up this vlog, I want to share sort of my preliminary conclusion about why Black history in North Dakota is such a complicated and split thing, where on the one hand we can see there is never not a time in the history of the state and the prehistory of the state when Black people are not migrating to North Dakota. Yet at the same time, it seems like there is never a time when one of these waves of migration meets up against sustained Black community from a previous wave of migration. At the start, we considered, what happened in other states to create a similar scenario. My conclusion is that in North Dakota, it really seems like it was the cultural racism of the white people of the state as all of these European immigrant groups became white, where they no longer saw Black people as American, where they were immigrants, but instead claimed that the space belonged to them as white people. I think with the conflict at the Minot Air Force Base, we see some of that. You can also read about it in the memoirs of Irabel Thompson, where she has a very positive image of not experiencing sort of this overt racism from people who were direct immigrants, and then understanding that that is not the same for the subsequent generations. We can see it with the recollections of Bob Cody, one of those farmers that we talked about. But I also want to show you a couple images here that indicate that that major narrative of sort of dispersal does cover over, a minor narrative of communalist history, of being able to study Black culture in North Dakota. So we have instances where businesses became really important, and we have one example of a nightclub in the state. So even though these aren't sustained, similarly to the periodic presence of Black churches in the state, the history is complicated. And of course, the history is not over. So we've talked a lot about Black migration to the state focused on the northern population corridor of North Dakota. And that's being replicated in the present, yet again, with what had become the whitest part of the state now being probably the most racially diverse place in the Northern Plains because of the Bakken oil rush. And it is yet to be seen, will this create sustained community, or will it fall in this narrative of migration and alienation? Another example, which will be interesting for future historians to look at and will require a lot more interrogation of identity development, is waves of West and Central African immigration to North Dakota's large cities. So, we've taken stock of the history and considered what it means in the context of North Dakota being a Western state. And hopefully, this is not the last time we are able to stop and revisit this history as it continues to develop. Thank you.